May 10, 1996. Mount Everest, 8,350 meters above sea level. Scott Fischer is standing still, not resting but standing completely still. His body is refusing every command that his brain is still desperately trying to send. A storm with winds reaching 110 kilometers per hour has erased every visual reference around him. The temperature, factoring in wind chill, has plunged below -70 degrees Celsius. And Scott Fischer, one of the most respected climbers on the planet, the man who had summit K2 without supplemental oxygen, the man the entire mountaineering community called Mr. Rescue because he never left anyone behind, can no longer move his feet. You already know he will not be coming down. What you do not yet know is what was happening inside that body. Why was the best prepared climber on that mountain the one left behind? And why, when Anatoly Bukreev finally reached him the next morning, did he find Scott Fischer with his hands completely bare, his thermal suit open, and one arm pulled out of the garment? In the kind of cold that can kill in minutes, the story of Scott Fischer is not a story about a storm. It is a story about what happens when a man is ultimately destroyed by his own greatest virtues. What did he say before he could no longer speak? The answer comes at the end, and it will change the way you understand everything that happened that day. To understand what happened on that mountain, you must first understand who Scott Fischer was, because the tragedy makes no sense without that context. Scott Eugene Fischer was born on December 24, 1955. He grew up between Michigan and New Jersey, the son of a family with German, Dutch, and Hungarian ancestry. He was an ordinary boy until the age of 15, when he watched a documentary with his father about the National Outdoor Leadership School, an outdoor survival and leadership program based in Wyoming. One documentary was all it took. The following summer, he traveled to the Wind River Range in Wyoming, and he never fully returned to the flat world below. He became a senior instructor at the very school that had inspired him. For years, he traversed the mountain ranges of America, steadily building his technique and his reputation. In 1990, Fischer and Wally Berg became the first Americans to reach the summit of Lhotse, the world's fourth highest mountain at 8,516 meters. In 1992, Fischer climbed K2, the second highest mountain on the planet, without supplemental oxygen, alongside Charlie Mace and Ed Viesturs. On that same expedition, he fell into a crevasse and severely injured his right shoulder. The doctor ordered an immediate descent. Fischer refused. Viesturs taped his shoulder to his body so it would not dislocate further. Fischer continued climbing using only his left arm, reaching the summit of K2 with a shattered shoulder and without oxygen. He had already abandoned his first summit attempt to rescue other climbers, and then returned to try again. That was Scott Fischer. In 1984, he and two friends founded Mountain Madness, an expedition guiding company based in Seattle. The idea was to take people to extraordinary mountains under professional guidance. The company was small. In 1995, Fischer took home about $12,000, but his name was growing. Starbucks was already sponsoring the brand, and Fischer possessed what no amount of money could buy: an impeccable reputation. John Krakauer, the journalist from Outside magazine who would be on Everest that fateful day, described Fischer simply: Fischer's strength and determination were legendary, but resumes do not capture everything. There was a nickname that Fischer carried throughout the entire mountaineering community: Mr. Rescue, the guy who would stop everything, including his own summit attempts, to help another climber in trouble. On K2, he had abandoned his first attempt to rescue 3 stranded climbers. After completing the rescue, he climbed again and reached the summit. Rescuing others came as naturally to him as breathing. What no one could have imagined was that this very trait would become part of what ultimately killed him. On February 14, 1981, Fischer married Jeannie Price, who had once been his student in a mountaineering course years earlier. They moved to Seattle and had 2 children, Andy and Katie Rose. Andy was 9 years old in May 1996. In 1994, Fischer climbed Everest for the first time without supplemental oxygen. On the same expedition, he removed more than 2,000 kilograms of trash and 150 abandoned oxygen cylinders from the mountain. He had already climbed the highest peaks on 6 of the 7 continents. By any objective measure, Scott Fischer was one of the greatest living American mountaineers. What brought him back to Everest in 1996 was ambition, business, and the absolute certainty that he was in control. Shortly before leaving, Fischer gave an interview to the Seattle Weekly. The reporter asked if he was afraid. Fischer replied, "I believe 100% that I'll come back. My wife believes 100% that I'll come back. She doesn't worry about me when I'm guiding because I'm going to make all the right decisions. When accidents happen, I think it's always human error. Always human error." He was right, just not in the way he imagined. The 1996 expedition departed from base camp on May 6th. The Mountain Madness team consisted of 19 people in total. Fischer, 2 experienced guides, Neil Beidelman and the Kazakh climber Anatoly Bukreev, 8 paying clients, and 8 Sherpas. Before going any further, an important concept. The Sirdar is the head of the high-altitude Sherpas on an expedition. He is the lead guide's right-hand man, responsible for coordinating the porters and ensuring logistics at the highest parts of the mountain. Fischer's Sirdar was Lopsang Jangbu Sherpa, young, extraordinarily strong, and considered one of the best of his generation. Fischer had the best team possible. Base camp sat at an altitude of 5,264 meters. From there, the team would make progressive ascents, reaching increasingly higher camps and then returning below to rest. This process is called acclimatization. The human body, when gradually exposed to low oxygen levels, begins to produce more red blood cells to compensate. It is like training the body to survive where it normally would not. Without this process, attempting the summit is suicide. Fischer had planned everything meticulously. He had identified that the window between May 5th and 12th offered the best historical conditions for a summit attempt. Base camp was bustling. There was confidence in the air. And then something happened that very few people have discussed enough. At Camp 2, at 6,400 meters, Fischer learned that his friend and client Dale Cruz was sick at Camp 1, 400 meters below. Here it is necessary to understand what ASE is, high-altitude cerebral edema. Imagine the brain beginning to swell inside the skull due to reduced pressure. The person becomes disoriented, unable to make even basic decisions. It is fatal if not treated with immediate descent. Fischer descended. He found Cruz and descended even further, all the way to base camp, accompanying his friend. Then he turned around and climbed back up. It was the right decision. It was exactly what Mr. Rescue would do. But think about what that meant physically. Fischer had expended vital energy and time on an up-down-up trek that covered more than 5,400 meters of elevation gain, days before attempting to climb the top of the world. When he returned to the team at Camp 2, he was visibly slower, but he said nothing. He did not complain. He simply kept going. On May 9th, the team reached Camp 4 at the South Col, at 7,150 meters. This was the last staging point before the final summit push. Average temperatures hovered around -40 degrees Celsius with constant wind. This is where climbers try to sleep, if they can, before setting off after midnight. Shortly after midnight on May 10th, the team set off. That day, in addition to Mountain Madness, Rob Hall's Adventure Consultants team would also attempt the summit, along with the Taiwanese expedition led by Makalu Gao. More than 30 climbers were on the same route on the same day. The congestion occurred exactly where everyone knew it would, at the Hillary Step. Before continuing, you need to understand what the Hillary Step is. It is a nearly vertical 12-meter rock face located at an altitude of 8,790 meters. It is the last major technical obstacle before the summit. On flat ground, it would be trivial. At 8,790 meters, in strong winds, wearing thick thermal gloves, with the brain functioning on roughly 1/3 of its normal oxygen supply, it becomes the most difficult passage on Everest. It accommodates only one climber at a time. On May 10, 1996, dozens of climbers needed to pass through there, climbing up and down on the same fixed rope. The result was a massive bottleneck that delayed the entire ascent for hours. Fischer had set a strict turnaround time of 2 p.m. This is a simple and absolute rule in high-altitude mountaineering. If you have not reached the summit by 2 p.m., you descend no matter how close you are, because every minute past 2 p.m. is 1 minute less of margin for the descent, for oxygen, and for the weather. Fischer and Hall knew this rule. They taught it. They demanded it of their clients. At 2 p.m. on May 10, 1996, Scott Fischer was still climbing. Wait, before you see what happened when the storm hit, and it will hit just a second. If you've made it this far, you already understand that this is not just a mountain story. It is about a man who knew everything and was still there. And from now on, every detail will make sense in a way that will be hard to forget. The storm arrived. It is 3:45 p.m. on May 10, 1996. Scott Fischer reaches the summit of Everest, 8,849 meters, the top of the world, for the second time in his life. 1 hour and 45 minutes past the safety cutoff time. Hours earlier, during the ascent, Krakauer had crossed paths with Fischer. He described it this way. Fischer pulled down his oxygen mask to greet him with the characteristic greeting he used with everyone. Bruce, with forced cheerfulness, gasping for breath. When Krakauer asked how he was doing, Fischer replied, "Just dragging my ass a little today for some reason. Just dragging his ass." The man who had climbed K2 without oxygen was being physically dragged by Lobsang Jangbu Sherpa through the most difficult parts of the ascent. The Sirdar, who was supposed to be coordinating the entire team, was instead using his own strength to haul the lead guide. This is where you need to understand what was likely happening inside Scott Fischer's body, because that explains everything that came after. HAPE, high-altitude pulmonary edema. The lungs begin to fill with fluid in response to the altitude. Not all at once, slowly. It is like drowning in slow motion from the inside out. Breathing becomes shallow. Every step requires a disproportionate effort. The body is working 4 times as hard to do half of what it would normally do. And in parallel, or in combination, likely ASE, high-altitude cerebral edema. The brain swells inside the skull. Time begins to warp. The perception of risk disappears. The person can no longer accurately assess how bad things truly are. And that is the cruelest aspect of these altitude illnesses. They destroy precisely the ability to realize that you have been destroyed. The mountain takes away from you the very tool you would need most to get out of it. Fischer reached the summit. He began to descend. Around 6 p.m., the storm hit, not gradually. Within minutes, winds surged to 110 kilometers per hour. Horizontal snow eliminated all visibility. The fixed ropes that served as lifelines were being buried. The route was disappearing while people were still trying to follow it. Dozens of climbers were scattered across the mountain at various stages of descent. Some were already below the Hillary step. Others were still near the summit. Rob Hall was standing higher up with Doug Hansen, an American mail carrier who had reached the top hours after Fischer, unable to continue descending. Hall would stay with Hansen. Both would die. Fischer was with Lobsang. They tried to descend together, but Fischer could not keep up the pace needed to get out of there before the cold did its work. They reached the balcony at 8,350 meters, a natural rocky platform on the southeast face of Everest, the last resting point before the summit. Mukalu Gao, the leader of the Taiwanese expedition, was there too, equally exhausted. Lobsang stayed. For hours he stayed. It was the decision of a Sirdar who understood his responsibility. You do not abandon the lead guide in a storm. But Fischer realized that if Lobsang stayed, they would both die on that rock. Fischer told Lobsang to go down to find Bucrive to send someone with oxygen. Those were Scott Fischer's last coherent words. Lobsang descended alone in some of the most hostile conditions imaginable. Bucrive, who had arrived at camp 4 hours earlier, made several attempts to move toward Fischer. The storm pushed him back every time. That very night, Bucrive would carry out 3 solo rescue operations that would go down in mountaineering history. He found Charlotte Fox, Tim Madsen, and Sandy Pittman semi-conscious in the snow and carried them one by one back to the tents. 3 lives saved by a single man in a blizzard at 7,900 meters. But Fischer was higher up, and the storm showed no sign of letting up. That night, at 8,350 meters, Scott Fischer was completely alone. There are no records of what happened during those hours. No camera, no radio, no witnesses, only what the body left as evidence when someone finally reached him. On the morning of May 11th, 2 Sherpas managed to reach Fischer and Gao. Gao was alive, weakened, but responsive. The Sherpas placed an oxygen mask over Fischer's face. Fischer was unresponsive. After rescuing other climbers and repeatedly attempting to make his way up the mountain, Bucrieve finally reached Scott Fischer. The oxygen mask was around his face, the tank empty. His hands were completely bare, no gloves. His thermal suit was open, pulled down from his shoulder, with one arm out of the garment. This has a name: paradoxical undressing. In the final stages of severe hypothermia, the blood vessels that had constricted to protect vital organs suddenly dilate. Warm blood flows to the skin, and the person feels intense, sudden heat, very real to them, in an environment of -70 degrees Celsius. The body removes the clothing because it believes it is on fire. Bucrieve covered Fischer's torso. He moved the body out of the way. He gathered the engraved knife, the ice axe, and the camera, which he would later give to Fischer's 9-year-old son. And he said, "There's nothing I can do. Scott is dead." What killed Scott Fischer? The easy answer is the storm, and the easy answer is wrong. The storm was only the trigger. What killed Fischer was a convergence of decisions that, individually, were all defensible, and that together formed a perfect trap. Fischer went down to rescue crews because it was the right thing to do, but he depleted physical reserves that do not recover in days in a place where the body never fully recovers. Fischer exceeded the turnaround time because he was committed to the clients, to the company, to the mission. But every minute past 2 p.m. was a safety margin lost. Fischer ignored the signals his own body was sending because the altitude had already compromised his ability to recognize those signals. That is the cruel paradox of Ase. The illness that destroys judgment does not let the person know that their judgment has been destroyed. And Fischer was Fischer, the man for whom stopping was not an option his brain naturally considered. Jon Krakauer wrote the sentence that perhaps defines this tragedy better than any technical analysis. The kind of individual programmed to ignore personal suffering and keep pushing toward the summit is often programmed to disregard signs of grave and imminent danger as well. The very thing that made Fischer extraordinary was the very thing that kept him from descending. Scott Fischer's body remains on Everest to this day. The Sherpas built a stupa, a Buddhist monument, outside the village of Dugla in Nepal, a day's hike from base camp. Dr. Ingrid Hunt, who accompanied the expedition, returned in 1997 to place a bronze plaque in his honor. The American Alpine Club established the Scott Fischer Memorial Conservation Fund, which supports environmentally committed expeditions around the world. A route on Kilimanjaro bears his name. Mountain Madness was sold in 1997 to Keith and Christine Boskoff. Keith died in 1999. Christine and her partner died while climbing in China in 2006. In 2008, guide Mark Gunlaugsson took over. The company still exists today in Seattle. Jeannie survived. Andy and Katie Rose grew up. Lobsang Jangbu Sherpa, the man who stayed with Fischer until the very end, who descended to seek help, who did everything he could, died in September 1996 in an avalanche during a new expedition to Everest. He was 25 years old. Bucrieve, who saved 3 lives that night and tried repeatedly to reach Fischer, died in December 1997 in an avalanche on Annapurna. The mountain holds no grudge. It simply does not forgive. The tragedy of 1996 changed commercial mountaineering permanently. The 2 p.m. turnaround time became a strict rule. Access to real-time weather forecasts improved. The debate over paying clients to altitudes where the difference between the possible and the fatal is measured in minutes has not ended, and probably never will. Before closing, one last thing. Lobsang stayed with Fischer for hours on that rock ledge at 8,350 meters. He was prepared to die there beside the guide. And it was Fischer, exhausted, sick, likely suffering a cerebral collapse, who sent him away. It was Fischer who insisted that Lobsang descend, that he go get help for the others. Until the very end, Scott Fischer's only coherent thought was to save someone other than himself. Mr. Rescue died trying to rescue everyone except himself.